The rain came down in violent sheets as Weston Brooks pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The streets were nearly empty, the late hour and storm keeping most people indoors. He was on his way home from his second shift at the auto repair shop, exhausted but eager to get back to his 6-year-old daughter, Kiara. Then he saw her. A woman stood near the entrance of the closed diner, her expensive-looking heels sinking into a puddle. Her blonde hair clung to her face, her coat doing little to protect her from the storm. She looked lost, confused, and completely out of place in this part of town. Weston hesitated. He didn't make a habit of involving himself in strangers' problems, but something about her made it impossible to walk away. With a resigned sigh, he approached. "You're gonna freeze out here," he said, raising his voice over the downpour. She looked up, startled. Her blue eyes were wide and, despite the rain, full of stubbornness. I was supposed to get a taxi, but my phone died." Weston exhaled, glancing at the empty streets. No cabs would be coming through this late, especially in this weather. "Where do you live?" he asked. She hesitated, biting her lip. "I was staying at the Rosewood Hotel, but I don't have my wallet on me." Weston didn't know much about luxury hotels, but even he knew the Rosewood wasn't the kind of place people in his neighborhood could afford. She was clearly wealthy, probably someone who had never had to worry about basic survival. He should walk away. This wasn't his problem. But then he thought of his daughter, sleeping soundly at home, and how he'd want someone to help her if she were ever in trouble. "Come on," he said, gesturing for her to follow. "I don't live far. You can dry off at my place and figure things out in the morning." Her eyes searched his, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. After a moment, she nodded. "Thank you." They walked in silence, the only sound the pounding rain and their hurried footsteps. When they reached his small apartment, Weston unlocked the door as quietly as possible. "Stay quiet," he whispered as they stepped inside. "My daughter's asleep." The woman's gaze softened. "You have a daughter," Weston nodded, shrugging off his soaked jacket. "Kiara, she's 6. The woman hesitated before offering a small smile. "I'm Brielle," he nodded in acknowledgement. "Bathrooms down the hall." "There should be a towel in there." Brielle disappeared into the bathroom, and Weston exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. He wasn't sure why he'd done this, bringing a complete stranger into his home, but something told him Brielle wasn't just another rich girl who had lost her way. When she returned, wrapped in one of his old sweatshirts, she looked different, less like someone who belonged in a penthouse and more like someone who had been through something. "Thank you, Weston," she said softly. He nodded. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." As he turned toward his room, he could feel her eyes on him. He ignored the strange pull in his chest. This was temporary. She'd be gone by morning, or so he thought. Weston awoke to the soft hum of movement in his apartment. His instincts kicked in immediately. Years of working late shifts and raising a child alone had made him hyper-aware of his surroundings. He pushed back the covers and stepped into the hallway, his eyes adjusting to the dim morning light filtering through the curtains. Brielle was in the kitchen. She stood near the small counter, fingers wrapped around a mug as she stared out the window. The oversized sweatshirt she had borrowed from him hung loosely on her frame, her damp blonde hair now a mess of soft waves. She looked out of place in his cramped kitchen, yet somehow she also looked like she belonged. "You're up early," Weston said, his voice rough from sleep. Brielle turned, startled, before offering a small smile. "I didn't want to wake you." Weston leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "You find a way to contact someone." She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Not yet." His brows furrowed. "No friends, family." Brielle gripped the mug tighter. "It's complicated." Weston didn't push, though curiosity gnawed at him. Instead, he walked past her and reached for the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup. "You hungry?" She glanced at the nearly bare fridge. "I can cook if you want." Weston raised an eyebrow. "Didn't peg you as someone who knew her way around a kitchen." Brielle let out a soft laugh. "I don't, but I can try." Weston shook his head, amused despite himself. He wasn't sure what to make of her. She was obviously from a world far removed from his own, but she wasn't acting like someone desperate to get back to it. As he pulled out a pan, the sound of small footsteps echoed from the hallway. "Daddy," Kiara stood in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her messy curls framed her round face, her tiny feet bare against the floor. When she saw Brielle, she froze. Weston crouched down. "Hey, kiddo, this is Brielle. She got caught in the rain last night and needed a place to dry off." Kiara's gaze flickered between them before she whispered, "Is she staying for breakfast?" Brielle knelt, her expression warm. "Only if you want me to." Kiara studied her for a moment before nodding. "Okay," Weston exhaled, relieved. His daughter was wary of strangers, but something about Brielle had passed whatever silent test Kiara always seemed to conduct. As Brielle helped set the table, Weston tried to make sense of the situation. He had taken her in for one night, expecting her to leave first thing in the morning. Yet she hadn't made any effort to leave, and for some reason he wasn't in a hurry to make her go. By midday, Brielle had settled onto the worn-out couch, flipping through an old book she had found on the shelf. Weston had gone out to the garage to check on a job, leaving her and Kiara alone. The little girl sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully coloring in a notebook. Every so often she would glance up at Brielle, as if debating whether to speak. Eventually she did. "Do you have a daddy?" Brielle hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I do." Kiara pressed her crayon harder against the paper. "Where is he?" Brielle swallowed. "Far away." Kiara nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "Is he nice?" Brielle stared at the page of the book without really seeing it. "Not always." Kiara frowned. "That's not good." Brielle forced a smile, but something about the little girl's innocence made her chest tighten. "No, it's not." Kiara turned back to her coloring. "Daddy's nice. He works a lot, but he always comes home." Brielle glanced toward the door, picturing Weston covered in grease, exhaustion lining his face, but still making sure he was here for his daughter. "He loves you very much," she said softly. Kiara smiled. "Yeah, I know." Brielle's heart ached at the quiet certainty in the child's voice. She had never felt that kind of unwavering love from her own father. She suddenly realized how different Weston was from the men she had grown up around, and how much she liked that. When Weston returned later that evening, Brielle was still there. He wasn't sure why that surprised him. Kiara had fallen asleep on the couch, her coloring book resting on her chest. Brielle stood and stretched. "She's amazing." Weston glanced at his daughter, a rare softness entering his expression. "Yeah, she is." Brielle hesitated before asking, "Where's her mother?" Weston's jaw tightened. "Gone," Brielle frowned. "Gone as in." "As in, she left when Kiara was a baby and never looked back." Weston's voice was even, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. Brielle's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," Weston shrugged. "Don't be. Kiara and I have been just fine on our own." Brielle studied him, seeing the quiet strength in the way he carried himself. He had built a life for his daughter with nothing but hard work and determination, and she suddenly wanted to know more. "Tell me something about you," she said, surprising even herself. Weston looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why?" Brielle smiled, tilting her head. "Because I want to understand the man who took a complete stranger in during a storm." Weston let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Not much to tell, grew up here, started working young. Got left with a kid and did what I had to do." Brielle frowned. "That's the short version. It's the only version." She didn't believe that, but she also knew he wouldn't give away more easily. "Well," she said, crossing her arms. "Since you won't share, I guess I'll have to tell you something about me instead." Weston raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Brielle hesitated. She could tell him the truth, that she was the daughter of a powerful businessman, that she had grown up in luxury, that she had spent her life being told what to do and who to be. But instead, she said, "I haven't felt at home in a long time." Weston's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "And now," Brielle swallowed, glancing at the sleeping child on the couch, at the small but warm apartment, at the man who had given her shelter without expecting anything in return. "Now, I'm not sure what I feel," she admitted. Weston didn't respond right away. But when he did, his voice was quieter than before. "Yeah," he said, "I know the feeling." Brielle's heart stuttered in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to hope. Weston had always been a man who lived by routine's work, Kiara, home. There was no room for distractions, no time for detours. And yet, Brielle had somehow slipped into the spaces between, fitting into his life in a way he hadn't expected. She hadn't left. He didn't ask why. He didn't press her for explanations. But every morning when he woke up, she was still there, and every night when he tucked Kiera in, Brielle was sitting on the couch, reading quietly or folding laundry as if she had always been part of their world. It should have unnerved him. Instead, it settled something deep inside him that he hadn't realized had been restless. One afternoon, while Kiera was at school, Brielle sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a newspaper with a concentrated frown. Weston was fixing the sink, something he had been putting off for weeks, but he caught the way her fingers tensed over the pages, the way her expression darkened. "You looking for something?" he asked, setting down the wrench. She startled slightly, as if she hadn't realized he was watching her. "No," she answered, a little too quickly. Weston wiped his hands on a rag. "You sure? Because you've been staring at that page like it insulted you." Brielle hesitated before turning the newspaper toward him. A large photo of a man in a tailored suit took up half the page, his sharp features unmistakable. Weston wasn't the kind of guy who followed business news, but even he recognized the name beneath the headline Brielle Caldwell. "Your father," he guessed. Her silence was answer enough. Weston waited, giving her space to decide if she wanted to talk. Eventually, she exhaled. "He's been looking for me," she admitted. Weston leaned against the counter. "You running from something?" Brielle traced the edge of the newspaper. "From him." "From the life he built for me." He wasn't sure what to make of that. Most people would kill for the kind of wealth and power her father had, yet Brielle had walked away. "You don't want to go back?" he asked. She shook her head. "I never wanted any of it." Weston studied her, trying to piece together the parts of her that she wasn't saying. He had learned enough about her over the past few weeks to know that she wasn't just some spoiled heiress playing runaway. There was something deeper, something that had made her choose a life that was so different from the one she had left behind. "What happens if he finds you?" Weston asked. Brielle's fingers tightened over the paper. "He'll drag me back, whether I want to go or not." Weston's jaw tensed. He didn't like the sound of that. She must have noticed the shift in his expression because she offered a small, tired smile. "I'll figure it out, I always do." Weston wasn't so sure. And he didn't like the idea of her having to. One evening, Weston came home to find Brielle and Kiera sitting on the floor, a deck of cards spread between them. Kiera was giggling, her face lighting up in a way that made something in Weston's chest tighten. "I win again," Kiera cheered, throwing her hands in the air. Brielle groaned dramatically. "How are you so good at this?" Kiera grinned. "Daddy says it's because I'm smart." Brielle glanced up at Weston, amusement flickering in her eyes. "I think he might be right." Weston leaned against the doorframe, watching them. He should have been used to seeing Brielle here by now, but something about this moment felt different, more permanent. Kiera turned toward him, her excitement bubbling over. "Daddy, Brielle said she might teach me how to bake cookies this weekend." Weston raised an eyebrow. "That right," Brielle shrugged. "I figured I should contribute something before you kick me out." Weston shook his head. "Not happening, kiddo. She's a guest, not a housekeeper." Kiera huffed. "But she wants to." Weston gave Brielle a questioning look. She met his gaze, something unreadable flickering there. "I don't mind staying if you don't mind having me." The words hung between them, heavier than they should have been. Weston exhaled. "You know you don't have to ask." Brielle looked away, but he caught the small, relieved smile that tugged at her lips. The knock came late at night, sharp and demanding. Weston was instantly on edge. Brielle froze, her face paling. Weston glanced at her before moving toward the door. When he opened it, a tall man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his presence radiating authority. "Mr. Brooks?" the man asked. Weston didn't confirm or deny. "Depends on who's asking." The man's gaze was sharp, assessing. "I'm here for Miss Caldwell." Weston didn't move. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to." Brielle appeared behind him, her voice steady. "Tell my father I'm not coming back." The man's expression didn't change. "You know he won't accept that." Brielle's jaw clenched. "That's not my problem." Weston stepped forward slightly, his stance unmistakable. "You heard her." The man studied them for a long moment before exhaling. "This isn't over." Then he turned and walked away. Brielle let out a shaky breath. Weston closed the door, turning to face her. "You okay?" she nodded, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. He's not going to stop, she admitted quietly. Weston didn't hesitate. Then we make sure he doesn't find you. Brielle looked up at him, something raw in her expression. Why are you helping me? Weston held her gaze. Because you don't deserve to be forced into something you don't want. Something in her eyes softened. For the first time, Weston realized just how much he wanted her to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because he wanted her here. And he wasn't sure what to do about that. Weston had never been the kind of man to second-guess his decisions. He made choices based on instinct, on necessity. But as he stood in the quiet of his apartment, staring at Brielle as she absently traced patterns along the rim of her coffee cup, he realized something had shifted. She wasn't just a stranger he had taken in. She wasn't just a temporary guest in his life. She had become something more. "You're quiet," Brielle said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. Weston leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "Just thinking." She tilted her head, watching him the way she always did, like she understood more than he ever said aloud. "About what?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Doesn't matter." Brielle set down her cup and pushed to her feet, stepping closer. "It does if it's keeping you this distracted." Weston exhaled, his gaze never leaving hers. "You." A flicker of something crossed her face, surprise, warmth, something deeper. "What about me?" she asked. Weston hesitated. He wasn't a man who spoke in flowery words or grand declarations, but he had never been one to lie to himself either. "I don't want you to leave," he admitted. Brielle's breath caught. His instinct was to take the words back, to bury them before they could shift the delicate balance between them. But then she reached out, fingers brushing against his forearm, grounding him in the moment. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. The admission settled between them, heavy with meaning. Weston's hand lifted, hesitating for only a second before he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then stay." Brielle let out a soft breath, as if she had been waiting for him to say it. Before she could answer, the sound of small footsteps padding across the floor broke the moment. Kiera appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Why are you guys up so early?" Weston glanced at the clock. He hadn't even realized the sun had barely risen. Brielle smiled, crouching to Kiera's level. "We just couldn't sleep, that's all." Kiera frowned, then looked between them as if sensing something had changed. "Are we making pancakes today?" Brielle glanced up at Weston, her expression soft. Weston nodded. "Yeah, kiddo." "We are." Kiera grinned, satisfied with the answer, and shuffled toward the kitchen table. Brielle lingered for a moment longer, her fingers brushing against Weston's before she turned to follow Kiera. And just like that, she was part of them. Days passed, and Brielle fell further into the rhythm of their lives. Weston found himself watching her more without meaning to, the way she laughed when Kiera told her stories, the way she hummed under her breath when she cooked, the way she fit into their home like she had always been there. But he also saw the moments when she tensed, when she checked the window, when the weight of her past pressed against her shoulders. One evening, after Kiera had fallen asleep, Weston found her sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. He sat beside her, waiting. Brielle let out a slow breath. "He won't stop looking for me," Weston nodded. "I know." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "And you're still willing to let me stay?" Weston met her gaze, unwavering. "Yeah." Brielle swallowed, something raw flashing in her eyes. "You don't even know what you're risking." Weston reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. "I don't care." Brielle exhaled, her grip tightening. For the first time, Weston saw the walls she had built start to crack. And he knew, without a doubt, that he would never let her break alone. The storm came in the form of a sleek black car pulling up outside the garage where Weston worked. It wasn't just any car, it was the kind that didn't belong in their part of town, the kind that demanded attention. Weston wiped his hands on a rag as the door opened and a man stepped out. He was older, sharp-featured, with the same piercing blue eyes as Brielle. Mitchell Caldwell. Weston didn't move, didn't speak. He waited. Mitchell closed the distance between them, his gaze assessing. "You're the man harboring my daughter." Weston didn't so much as flinch. "She's not a prisoner, she's where she wants to be." Mitchell's jaw tensed. "She belongs at home." Weston exhaled slowly. "She has a home, it's just not the one you built for her." Mitchell's expression darkened. "You think this is love? You think she'll stay?" Weston didn't answer. He didn't need to. Mitchell shook his head. She'll come back eventually, when she realizes she wasn't meant for this life. Weston clenched his jaw. You don't know her as well as you think. Mitchell studied him, then let out a slow exhale. I'll make you an offer. Weston's eyes narrowed. Mitchell's voice was smooth, calculated. Whatever number you have in mind, I'll double it. Walk away from her. Convince her to come home. Weston let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Mitchell frowned. You're refusing money. Weston met his gaze, unwavering. Yeah. Mitchell studied him for a long moment before sighing. She'll regret this. Weston didn't respond. Mitchell turned, stepping back into his car. The door shut, the engine humming to life. But before the car pulled away, Weston caught the flicker of movement in the window. Brielle, she had seen everything. That night, Brielle stood in the doorway of Weston's bedroom, arms wrapped around herself. He's not going to stop, she whispered. Weston sat on the edge of the bed, watching her. I know. She hesitated, voice breaking. I don't want you and Kiera caught in this. Weston stood, crossing the space between them. We're not caught in anything. You're part of this family now. Brielle's breath hitched. Weston cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. I'm not letting you go. Tears burned in her eyes, but she didn't look away. Weston leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. I love you, he murmured. Brielle let out a shaky breath. You do? Weston nodded. Yeah. And if you think I'm letting some suit take you away from me, you don't know me at all. A tear slipped down Brielle's cheek, but this time it wasn't from fear. She wrapped her arms around him, holding on like she never planned to let go. I love you too, she whispered. Weston's grip tightened, and in that moment he knew. No amount of money, no amount of threats would ever take her away from him. She was his. And she was finally home. The evening air was cool as Weston leaned against the balcony railing, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Inside, Brielle was helping Kiera with her bedtime routine, her soft laughter carrying through the open window. It was a sound Weston had grown used to, one that had begun to feel like it belonged here. But tonight, something was different. Mitchell Caldwell's visit had been a storm cloud over everything, a reminder that Brielle's past was still reaching for her, refusing to let go. Weston wasn't naive enough to think the man would just walk away. He was powerful, wealthy, and used to getting his way. Weston had never been intimidated by men like that, but this wasn't just about him. It was about Brielle. It was about Kiera. It was about the life they had built together these past few weeks, a life that felt more real than anything Weston had known in years. The balcony door slid open and Brielle stepped outside, wrapping her arms around herself. She stood beside him in silence, her gaze following the same distant lights. Kiera's asleep, she said softly. Weston glanced at her, taking in the way her expression was carefully guarded. You heard what he said, she nodded. I did. Weston let out a slow breath. You scared? Brielle hesitated before shaking her head. Not of him, of what he can do maybe, but not of him. Weston turned fully toward her. You don't have to fight this alone. She met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. I know, but I don't want you and Kiera caught in the crossfire. Weston's jaw tightened. That's not your decision to make. Brielle exhaled, frustration creeping into her voice. Weston, my father doesn't accept failure. If he wants something, he gets it. He's not going to stop until what? Weston interrupted. Until he drags you back to a life you don't want. Brielle looked away, her fingers gripping the railing. I don't know what his next move will be, and that terrifies me. Weston reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Then we figure it out together. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the fight in her dimming just enough for him to see the exhaustion beneath it. You make it sound so simple. It is, Weston said. You stay, we face whatever comes. End of story. Brielle let out a shaky breath, her fingers curling around his. I want to believe that. Weston squeezed her hand. Then do. For a long moment they stood there, the city stretching out before them, the weight of the moment pressing against them. Then Brielle did something he hadn't expected. She turned, stepping closer, and rested her forehead against his chest. Weston wrapped his arms around her without hesitation, holding her tighter than he ever had before. Whatever came next, he wouldn't let her face it alone. The next morning, Weston left for the garage earlier than usual. He didn't tell Brielle why, and she didn't press, but he could see the curiosity in her eyes as he kissed her forehead before heading out. He had spent most of the night thinking, running through every possible way this could end. He had never been a man with much to lose before Kiera, before Brielle. Now, the thought of someone like Mitchell Caldwell threatening the life they had built made his blood run cold. So he went to the one person who knew how to handle men like that. "You're out of your damn mind," Jackson scoffed, tossing a wrench onto the workbench. "You seriously want to go up against Mitchell Caldwell?" Weston crossed his arms. "I don't want to, but I will if I have to." Jackson shook his head. "You're playing with fire, man." Weston didn't flinch. "I don't care." Jackson sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I get it. You care about her, but this guy, he's not the kind of man you can just tell off and expect to walk away unscathed." Weston leveled him with a steady look. "I'm not looking for a fight, I just need to know what kind of leverage he has over her." Jackson eyed him carefully before exhaling. "Fine, I'll make some calls." Weston nodded. "Appreciate it." Jackson smirked. Yeah. Just don't get yourself killed over some high society runaway." Weston didn't bother correcting him. Brielle wasn't just some rich girl on the run. She was everything. By the time Weston returned home that evening, Brielle was pacing the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Where were you?" she asked the second he stepped inside. Weston shut the door behind him, taking his time before answering. "Handling things." Brielle let out a sharp breath. "Weston," he closed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands settling on her arms. "I need you to trust me." Brielle's expression softened, but the worry didn't disappear. "I do, but I don't want you taking risks because of me." Weston shook his head. "This isn't just about you, it's about us. It's about Kiera. I'm not letting your father decide how this ends." Brielle searched his face before finally exhaling. "What did you find out?" Weston hesitated before answering. "Your father's business is built on power, and power is built on perception. If you disappear quietly, he wins. But if you walk away publicly, if you make it clear you're not under his control, he loses face." Brielle frowned. "So what? I announce I'm leaving and hope he backs off." Weston's grip tightened slightly. "Not hope. Make it impossible for him to pull you back without consequences." Brielle's breath hitched. "You really think that'll work?" Weston nodded. "I do." For the first time that night, something like relief flickered in her expression. Then, before he could react, she leaned up and kissed him. It wasn't tentative or hesitant, it was a promise. Weston pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, pouring everything he couldn't say into it. When they finally pulled apart, Brielle rested her forehead against his. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do this." Weston smiled against her skin. "Together." And for the first time since this all started, he knew they were going to win. The plan was simple on paper. Brielle would go public with her decision to leave her father's world, making it impossible for him to reclaim her without damaging his reputation. But in reality, it was far from simple. Weston knew Mitchell Caldwell wouldn't go quietly. The man had built an empire on control, and losing face was not something he would tolerate. But Weston also knew Brielle. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived on his doorstep weeks ago, soaked from the rain and unsure of her place in the world. She had found her voice, her strength. They were going to do this together, and Mitchell would have no choice but to accept it. Late that night, Brielle sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the laptop screen. Weston stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders as she prepared to send the statement to the press. "This is it," she murmured. Weston squeezed her shoulders. "You ready?" Brielle inhaled deeply, then nodded. Without another word, she pressed the button. The email was sent. There was no turning back now. The next morning, the media had already picked up the story. Articles flooded the internet with headlines about Mitchell Caldwell's daughter publicly severing ties with his empire. News outlets speculated about why she had walked away, some calling it a rebellion, others hinting at hidden scandals. But most importantly, Mitchell could no longer claim she had simply gone missing. Weston sat across from Brielle at the kitchen table, Kiera still asleep in the other room. He watched as she scrolled through the articles, her fingers gripping the edge of the laptop. "It's done," she said, mostly to herself. Weston reached for her hand. "Whatever happens now, we face it together." Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Weston immediately stood, his body tense. Brielle followed, her expression unreadable. When Weston opened the door, he wasn't surprised to see Mitchell standing there, his usual polished demeanor slightly strained. His sharp gaze flickered past Weston to where Brielle stood just behind him. "You made quite the statement," Mitchell said. Brielle stepped forward, her voice steady. "I meant every word." Mitchell exhaled slowly as if reining in his frustration. "You've made your point, now come home." Weston's muscles tensed, but Brielle didn't waver. "This is my home." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." Brielle lifted her chin. "No, I'm finally making my own choice." For a long moment, Mitchell said nothing. Then his gaze landed on Weston, assessing in a way that made it clear he was searching for weakness. "You think this life is enough for her?" Mitchell asked. Weston didn't hesitate. "I know it is." Mitchell exhaled through his nose, then turned back to Brielle. "If you do this, you're on your own. No inheritance, no access to the family name, nothing." Brielle's hand found Weston's, her fingers lacing with his. "I don't need any of it." Mitchell studied her for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. "I hope, for your sake, you don't regret this." Brielle didn't flinch. "I won't." Without another word, Mitchell turned and walked away. When the door shut, Brielle released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Weston pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "It's over," she whispered. Weston pressed a kiss to her hair. "Yeah, it is." For the first time in her life, Brielle was free, and she had never been happier. Months passed, and life settled into something beautiful. Brielle had found work at a small community center, helping children with after-school programs. Weston continued at the garage, and Kiara thrived, her laughter filling their home every day. One evening, Weston took Brielle to the rooftop of the apartment building, the city stretching below them. Candles flickered around them, the night air warm. Brielle turned to him, eyes shining. "What's all this?" Weston reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Brielle's breath caught. Weston dropped to one knee, his gaze never leaving hers. "I didn't plan on falling in love with you, but I can't imagine my life without you now. You and Kiara are everything to me. So, Brielle Caldwell, or whatever last name you want to go by, will you marry me?" Tears welled in Brielle's eyes as she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes." Weston slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a kiss, the city lights glowing around them. This was their life, their future, and it was exactly where they were meant to be.